60973 and watch us on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, Scotland will see its first ever recall by-election after the SNP politician Margaret Ferrier lost her seat in Parliament. A petition's gathered enough signatures to force her to stand down. It's because she'd broke COVID rules in September 2020, as LBC's Sophie Adams explains.
The 62-year-old travelled to the Commons while waiting on a COVID test result, then made the decision to travel back to Glasgow on the train while knowing she'd tested positive for the virus.
A leisure club group has been fined more than £2.5 million after a 3-year-old boy died in one of its swimming pools. Rocco Wright was pulled from the water by his father at the David Lloyd Centre in Leeds in April 2018. Rishi Sunak insists changes to alcohol duty will help to grow the UK economy. He says it will support pubs and small breweries, despite publicans claiming across the board that customers will see price rises. The Prime Minister will be here exclusively with Nick Ferrari at breakfast from 7, which you can watch live on Global Player. And Nationwide has recorded the largest annual fall in UK house prices since 2009. Figures show the average property value dropped by 3.8%. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 33 points at 76.66. The pound buys $1.27 and euro 16. LBC weather: showers spreading northeastwards tonight with a low of 7. Unsettled tomorrow with heavy showers spreading east, drier in the north and west with a high of 20 Celsius. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question with me, Iain Dale. On the panel tonight we have Siân Berry, former co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. She's a member of the London Assembly, but possibly not for much longer because she's just been selected as the candidate for the Green Party in Brighton Pavilion to, I say hopefully in inverted commas, because there will be some people that don't wish you luck, Siân, to hopefully succeed Caroline Lucas as MP. Lord Hayward, Robert Hayward, is Conservative peer polling analyst. He's with us too. Ella Whelan, journalist and commentator who's a columnist for Spike Online, and Jonathan Liss, political commentator. They're all here to answer your questions. You know the number, 0345 6060 973. There's not a lot of new news around today in some ways, but why don't you give us a call on the government admitting that it can't say when its new barge off the Dorset coast, well it says coach here, will actually house any refugees. Ministers are wanting mandatory prison sentences for repeat offenders for both violent and non-violent crimes. Polling shows a majority of motorists now prefer Labour to the Conservatives, but only a third of all voters think Labour will actually win the next election outright. 0345 6060 973, and of course you can watch us, as you know, on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first question. It's from Chris in Richmond. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Iain. Hello, panel. Is Rishi Sunak on the wrong side of the electorate by focusing/obsessing on motoring issues?
Siân Berry.
Well, I mean, it is every single day, isn't it, at the moment? Attacking low-traffic neighbourhoods, attacking 20 miles an hour. We've had a big attack today on the plan, the very, very mild plan to phase out sales of new diesel and petrol cars by 2030. That's a very, very mild policy, and trying to put that off as well as the
which the EU have done.
The new oil and gas licences question as well. I mean, this is obviously a posture that the government have decided works in their favour with some of the voters, but I'm looking around the internet. I'm looking at the letters page in my local newspaper.
Well, that's always a mistake.
But I mean, yeah, you think so, But the kind of sort of people, the normal people who will respond to shows like this, who will write to the local paper, I'm not talking about politicians or people involved in politics here, are seeing straight through it. They know that the environment, the climate systems, the biosphere is not going to go along with policies that simply cancel green issues, start pumping more CO2 into the atmosphere, go back on the already mild things that are going on. People want to see vision and action on this, and I think it's going to backfire on them very, very soon. I think it's a short-term populist thing that they're trying out, and I hope that the wiser heads within the Conservative Party, the people like Lord Deepen, who's been chairing the Climate Change Committee, will make them go back on this before they have to write their manifesto, because this is a manifesto of death, if so.
Oh, that's quite a claim. That's almost akin to saying we're boiling the planet, isn't it?
Well, I mean, have you looked at the weather around the world recently? This is not normal.
Very wet in this country in the last month.
Well, I mean, is that normal for July? I'm not sure it is. So, we do need to be taking...
I was born on St Swithin's Day, so I know it is quite normal.
I mean, you can't turn on the television without seeing extremely extreme weather. Things burning down that have never burned down before. Floods in places that have never had floods. Look at China. That's not the part of China that usually floods. This is serious.
But if you are a motorist, you're probably feeling a little bit hard done by at the moment, aren't you?
Iain, what's a motorist, though? I mean,
or somebody who drives a car.
We're all people who sometimes have to get in a car or drive a car. If you're talking about people who are committed to driving everywhere they possibly can, as a hobby, then maybe that's a motorist. But most of us are just people who need to get places. And if we're driving in a car, it's because we haven't got alternatives. When I asked people in London, do you feel forced to own a car? A quarter of people in outer London said yes. And that is not people who are motorists because they want to be. That's people who feel forced to invest in a vehicle that they would much rather not own if they had good alternative public transport to get them where they need to go.
Well, in London, there is no excuse, let's face it, because public transport in London is
in
probably...
outer London, it's not as good.
Well,
it's
in
more
some
like
parts of outer
any
London,
other part
you're
of the country.
Most parts of outer London.
South of the river, I'm sure you've heard that before. Ella?
I don't agree with this government on almost anything apart from their opposition to LTNs and the ULEZ. Soft as it may be at the moment, I'd actually like to see them go a lot further, because the issue of how we deal with, talk about even climate crisis or climate change or boiling or heating or whatever way you want to put it, has been intensely undemocratic so far. I mean, even the scandal that seems to have just been sort of brushed under the carpet, but with the way in which the Sadiq Khan and plans for the expansion of the ULEZ, the way in which that consultation was took place, and the sidelining of lots of responses that came from people who were motorists, who were a little bit more than ticked off at being stopped from using their cars.
The courts said it was all fine.
Yeah, but if you look at the way in which the consultation took place, there was a lot of manoeuvring. There was a lot of sort of cherry picking of let's hone in on young people who are in London much less likely to own a car than your average 42-year-old mum who's got 3 kids and cannot get the Aldi shop on a bus coming home after work. I think the reason why the ULEZ and the LTN phenomenon has become such a big deal is because it's a perfect example of politics being done to people without their consent, without their consultation. London is this is happening all over the country, but if you take London, because we're in London, that's where I live, take London as an example. It's a city that has to function. It's a city where people have to get around, like I said, to do their weekly shop. Also, care workers, tree surgeons, builders, plumbers, Ocado deliverymen, everything. The city runs on transport. The city runs on cars and vehicles and lorries. And what we're doing at the moment is pretending that doesn't happen. And so you enforce all these sort of LTNs and ULEZ zones, and you make people charge people through the nose for something that is necessary in a city, because we're not making rail and trains cheaper. We're not doubling the schedules. In places like Bexley, you are literally under house arrest now. I mean, without a car, you cannot go anywhere, because the buses run like once every 2 hours, and you'd be lucky if you get on it because they're the small buses, not the big ones. They're crammed, they're unpleasant, and you can't do anything other than sit there if you're lucky to sit with a book. You can't do anything with your day functioning. If you're, as I am at the moment, got a buggy on me most of the time, it is a nightmare.
Thanks for not bringing it into the studio. Much appreciated.
Well, yeah, but the point here is I just get entirely depressed by the sort of emotionalised language around what is a question of a political and scientific challenge, which is, yes, human beings have an effect on the planet. We all know that by now. We know that there are things that should happen, making things more efficient, more cheaper is something that I care a lot about, but also green, all these things throw together into a debate. That's not what's happening. What's happening is we're being told that you have to have an excessively poor quality of life, that you have to be stripped of your assets. I mean, the ULEZ literally means that people are losing assets in the form of their cars, thousands of pounds, in the name of the planet, which Siân has personified by saying, the planet won't have any truck with our policies, as if like Mother Earth, nature is like
physics.
This woman in the corner who's like shaking her finger at us.
Just the laws of physics.
These are political debates that people need to, the public needs to be engaged in.
Jonathan Liss.
Well, I think it's completely extraordinary that on the back of 500 votes in Oxbridge, the entire conversation has now shifted to a voter's apparent disdain for anything environmental, anything to do with green or clean energy. It's such opportunism on the part of the government that they've spied a tiny opportunity in this desperate attempt to cling to power by Rishi Sunak. And now he thinks that because a few hundred people, and the margin was only a few hundred people in Oxbridge, were protesting against a car charge, which most of them wouldn't have actually faced, by the way, because the communication was quite poor. Most people don't actually pay the ULEZ. Now, the government is sort of throwing our children and grandchildren under the bus, for the most extraordinary short-term gains, which I don't think, as Siân was saying, are actually going to be gains, because the most important thing to remember here is that the public is overwhelmingly behind measures to combat climate change. People believe that climate change is happening. They want clean air. We've all been on high streets where we struggle to breathe. It's not fun. And there is evidence that people are actually dying because of dirty air in London and other big cities. And so these measures are actually popular. Now, where I do actually agree with Ella a little bit is that we need to have consultation. Now, obviously, I don't think it's undemocratic because councils are democratically elected. The mayor was democratically elected. And even ULEZ was pioneered by Boris Johnson, who was democratically elected as mayor as well. But I do think that there needs to be greater buy-in from local communities. So, if people don't necessarily want to have a low-traffic neighbourhood in their area, then that has to be respected. I agree that these things shouldn't be imposed from above, whether that's at sort of local level or at Westminster level. I do think it's extraordinary that the government is now, amid all this sort of conversation about decentralising power in this country, now wants to sort of overrule councils about what speed limit they can have on their roads, what kind of traffic calming measures they can have on their sort of suburban sort of side streets. That's not the job of a government, which is meant to be looking at a broad picture and is meant to be actually combating climate change, which everyone agrees is happening and needs to be combated.
I understand what you mean about the Uxbridge by-election, but presumably by this emphasis on sort of measures which you might say are sort of slightly anti the green agenda, I wouldn't go over the top, but slightly, they must have done some polling on this. I mean, they're not going to announce all these measures if they think that the majority of the country are going to be against them, are they?
Ian, I think that you might have more confidence in Rishi Sunak's political ability than I have. This man is a desperate and cynical man. He is failing on every single electoral and political sort of calculus. And the one tiny glimmer of light the Conservatives have had is holding on to a seat they've held since 1970. Not even Tony Blair was able to get Uxbridge. So if this is the measure of of success. And they just think, well, they're going to put all of their eggs in that particular basket. They think they want to appeal to a certain section of the electorate which is cheesed off with environmental measures that might be a little bit sceptical, and they think that that's the only way of keeping power.
Hayward, because I mean that is an interesting thesis, isn't it? Because we've had this announcement today on crime, and I always think whenever a political party, particularly the Conservative Party, announces a tough on crime agenda,
the Labour Party.
Well, the Labour Party have been doing it again this week as well. But you're quite near an election, aren't you? I mean, that is quite obvious. And it seems to me that they're probably they're hunkering down. They are appealing to what they think is their base, and think, well, we just need to make sure we win. We're going to lose the next election, but we'll win enough seats to avoid a total humiliation.
Well, I think Jonathan is right to the extent that this has been triggered by the Uxbridge by-election. But what we've not got at the moment is actually changes in policy, whether it's the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. I will say, I've always been a fan of Siân's, but she started by saying normal people who write to the local paper. There's no such thing as a normal person who writes to the local paper.
I mean, I used to write. I wrote to my local paper at the age of 16. So
You destroyed your reputation in that opening sentence. But it's interesting. I think, given the absence of comment, I'm the only person sat round this panel who doesn't have a car. Now, I happen to be single. I don't have the problem that couples do, and they need to get their kids to one place or another. There's no question about that. But I haven't had a car for 20 years. I've used public transport. I'm lucky enough to live in South London, but inner South London, and I can use buses and tubes easily. So I am very concerned about...
Do you not go to supermarkets?
I do.
How do you get your stuff back then?
I carry it.
I suppose if you're single and you don't eat very much, I suppose that's okay.
This is it. I mean, if you have a load of caveats and you don't, which is, that's fine. And actually, as it happens, if there was a bus that ran from Aldi to my door that had space for the buggy and my 6 bags of shopping, because I can't afford to do it in little bits, I have to buy in bulk, and I could read my book while the baby naps, I mean, hallelujah, that would be lovely. But that's not the world in which we live.
I would add,
and as it happens, I like driving.
I would add as a caveat that I do about once every 2 to 3 months a heavy shop. I go to Tesco's in the Old Kent Road and then get a cab or get a friend to drive me back. So very, very rarely I use a car. But most of the time I either walk...
But do you buy this war on motorists that we keep hearing about?
As I say, what we're talking about here is a series of discussions that does arise, as Jonathan indicated, from the result in the Uxbridge by-election. It was not a few people. It was not 500 people, because you look at the difference in the result between what happened in Uxbridge on one side and what happened in Selby and Somerton and Frome on the other side. There were huge numbers of people who chose a different path in Uxbridge from the other 2 by-elections. And Ella's right, it's not just in London.
There was still a huge swing to Labour. I mean, it wasn't a static Conservative vote.
I didn't say that, and I'm very precise about the numbers that I'm referring to. But 3 weeks before the Uxbridge by-election, the Conservatives got their first seat on Cambridge City Council for a decade. Why? Because the people in the relevant ward, King's Hedges, were rebelling against Cambridge City Council's policy in relation to cars. It's not some minor matter. The key thing on environmental issues is you have to take the public with you, and that's not happening at the moment.
Just a quick text from Simon, who says, doesn't Jonathan Liss realise, you're going to like this, just how far down the rabbit hole Iain Dale is when it comes to the Tories? It's awkward, embarrassing and pathetic the way he clings on to that party. Wake up, Iain. Have you not even been listening to my show for the last 6 months? I think we need to go to a break. It's 19 minutes past 8.
Tomorrow morning from 7 on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
Join me, Rishi Sunak, as I take your calls on LBC.
Put your questions to the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, only on LBC. leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
With us answering your questions are Siân Berry, former leader of the Green Party, Robert Hayward, Lord Hayward, Conservative peer and polling analyst, Ella Whelan from Spike Online, and Jonathan List, political commentator. We were just talking about the timing of the next election in the break, and that's the subject of the next caller's question. Shahid in Hemel Hempstead. Hi, Shahid. What would you like to ask?
Yeah, hi. My question is, if you were in Rishi Sunak's position, not him necessarily, but if you were in his position, when would you call the next general election, and on what kind of policies would you go into the country with?
Robert Hayward.
I think it'll be in October next year, which means we're some 15 months away. The reason I think that is because worldwide interest rates will probably be coming down at that point, and that is likely to be the case in Britain if it is in other parts of the world associated with inflation. You go into an election, people are suggesting it might be in May, but that comes immediately after the winter, where waiting lists in hospitals are always at their worst. You have a longer period of time to reduce the post-COVID waiting lists. The post-Boris, Liz Truss saga will be further away, and Rishi will have the time to prove that he can pick up the pieces post those events, and therefore will be able to project himself in a number of better ways than he would earlier. And I think on that basis and a series of other matters, then I think it'll be October rather than May.
Ella.
Well, I'm not very good at doing the whole kind of playing the game of when it should be, but I think since the Boris Liz Truss saga, the government has been on very shaky grounds in terms of legitimacy. Not technically, because obviously everything has been done technically right, but I think there just has been this sentiment that a mood that it doesn't resemble anything like what happened in 2019. Yes, everybody uses the excuse of the pandemic or even the war in Ukraine and say, everything's changed, so we've changed, and what's the big deal? But in actual fact, I think the momentousness of 2019 and the political direction that it alluded to in terms of democracy, in terms of things related to Brexit, have just been scrapped. There's so little of that left in the Conservative Party at the moment that I would call it as soon as I could. I caveat that all, though, with the fact that a general election does not excite me in the least at all, because the choice is so poor. I think there is very, very little difference, really, when you come down to ideology between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. Yes, there are some sort of headline differences, as they'd like to sort of make it out to be, but on issues like what we've just been talking about, climate change and net zero, on things relating to the economy, on big questions even around immigration, they're very, very similar. There's not a lot of change on the table at the moment from any of the parties. So as you can tell by the tone of my voice, I think, like most people, I'm really quite depressed about the prospect of it all.
Which, Robert, indicates to me, not just because Ella said it, but if you look at other factors too, particularly Tory voters maybe staying at home because they can't bring themselves to vote Labour or Lib Dem or Green, the turnout of the next election is likely to be very low. Do you think also, just as an added question to Shahid, that actually the result of the next election is almost a foregone conclusion, that most Tories think they've lost anyway, and that this whole idea, they're a tired government, it's time for a change, there's very little that Rishi Sunak can do about that?
Most elections are either time for a change or we need another period of government to prove. And that's essentially what the whole campaign comes down to from the two major parties. And I'm answering that question in that form at this stage. So it isn't clear, because all the opinion polls show there's a huge block of undecided 2019 Conservative voters, roughly 50%, it varies in one form or another, who haven't decided where they're going to cast their vote. But what is striking, and Ella touched on it, there is a serious disenchantment with politics in general, And Keir Starmer is not viewed strongly in the way that, sadly, I'm more than old enough. I've been an MP and out by the time Tony Blair became into power. But Keir Starmer doesn't have that hold on the electorate in the way that Tony Blair did at an equivalent position running up to an election. Okay. Labour support is weak.
Jonathan.
It reminds me of that joke, what would you do about something? If I was Rishi Sunak, I wouldn't be starting from here. But
it's not a very funny joke.
No, I wasn't. I got a laugh from Siân. Anyway, the fundamental point is that Sunak has not covered himself in glory, shall we say. The people do not like him. The longer he stays in office, the worse it gets for him. This is the fundamental point that I sort of see.
It's not the same for any prime minister in a way.
Well, that's just maybe, but if you are trailing your opponent on every level, and the Tories are now behind Labour on every metric, they're even losing to Labour on the economy and on immigration, classic kind of conservative strengths. So even though I see the arguments that Robert puts forward about interest rates, if you're thinking about it from a nakedly political perspective, if you're Sunak, you're not going to be in office after the election. So you have two options. Either you stay in office for as long as you possibly can to try and get some kind of legacy, to try and stamp your authority on the country, to do something that you want to do, or you go as quickly as you can, because, as Tony Blair was saying, if you wait for something to turn up, often what turns up is that the public like you even less. So does Rishi Sunak want to be the kind of Prime Minister who loses nobly, goes down to sort of a small Labour majority, for example? I think it will be a big one. Or does he want to sort of throw all of the eggs in that basket and go down to a historic landslide, which may even eclipse Labour in 1997? So if you're thinking about what he actually wants to do as Prime Minister, the pledges, from whichever side of the political spectrum you're on, were embarrassingly thin, and he's not even going to make them. So this is not a man with a grand ambition. This is at best a technocrat who was at the level of a junior minister, who enjoyed the job of Chancellor because it involved spreadsheets, which we all know he loves, but he doesn't have a grand ambition for the country. He's not a visionary in any way. Even his allies in the Conservative Party would concede that. He doesn't have a great vision for the country as someone like Margaret Thatcher did, who obviously is a huge opponent of mine politically. Yes, I mean, it doesn't really matter, to be honest, whether he goes in May or October, because he's going to lose.
But what do you think he will do?
I suspect he'll probably go as long as he can, because, he likes to be in office. He likes power. We can see how cynical and desperate he is in trying to stay to power. So he'll probably go at the last minute. Probably he won't go till January 2025, because no one wants a winter election. But I suspect he'll probably go in the autumn of next year.
Siân?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. He clearly enjoys being Prime Minister and probably will hang on for as long as possible. Now, I keep getting asked questions like this, and obviously from a Green point of view, it is beneficial if the two main parties are the same as each other. The most disproportional election where the Greens did best was in 2015, where in a very different sort of place, both main parties were roughly the same. They all wanted to carry on with austerity. There was all growing anti-immigrant rhetoric going on in response to the Farage communications, and it was all very depressing. And we offered some hope, and our vote grew, and that was great. But right now, I'm very worried that the fragile consensus there has been on climate within the Conservative Party is breaking down. We're going to see some seriously bad and dangerous policies from the Conservatives. I'm also worried that with every week that goes by, Labour are drifting further and further to the right, ditching pledges that we've really basic social justice pledges, like the two-child benefit cap, like the rent controls policies that the mayors of the cities have absolutely pioneered. They're turning their back on that. They won't even get rid of the right to buy policy or invest actual public money into social housing. They've cut their green pledges. The longer this goes on, the worse a new Labour government is going to be. So even though we'd want that from a green success point of view, we've got first past the post. And if we're going to have a Labour-led government with green influence, we want it to be as soon as possible before they get even worse.
If I was advising the Green Party, I imagine that, I think I would be saying that what part of your strategy ought to be to say to soft Conservative and Labour voters, look, you've obviously got fed up with your own parties. We realise you're not actually Greens, but we think we can offer you something. If you want to protest by voting for us, we will welcome your vote. Is that something that you're going to do?
We are campaigning to win votes, because remember, voters
I know
are not
that.
party.
I know that.
So remember that voters
but the
are
Liberal
not party
Democrats
members.
used to be the recipient of the plague on all of your houses vote. They're not so much now. So there's a gap in the market for you.
We are building a seriously credible alternative for people who are wanting to cast like you say, a plague on both your houses votes. But people, they're not all like you, Ian. They haven't got long loyalties to parties. They are prepared to change their votes. And, I go out on the doorsteps with people fighting for local council seats. It's incredibly easy to persuade people to vote Green. We've seen some huge swings from Conservatives to Greens, from Labour to Green as well. But the really big ones are from Conservatives, where we're convincing people who've previously voted Conservative, they're not Conservatives, to back us. Because we just seem really sensible these days compared with what's going on in the populist right.
I thought you were going to say compared to previous days.
No, compared to the other parties, we seem very, very credible, and people have seen us getting elected.
Right.
And
lots more questions. I'm sorry, I've got to move on. Lots more questions coming in. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. It's 8:32 News Headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
Scotland will see its first ever recall by-election after the SNP politician Margaret Ferrier lost her seat in Parliament. The petitions gathered enough signatures to force her to stand down after she broke COVID rules in 2020. A child has died at a holiday park in Cornwall. The Atlantic Reach Resort says it's heartbroken by the death of what's reported to be a young boy and is supporting all guests and staff. And Rishi Sunak insists changes to alcohol duty will help to grow the UK economy. He says it will support pubs and small breweries, something pub owners dispute. LBC weather, showers spreading northeastwards tonight, drier in the north with a low of 7.
Tomorrow morning from 7 on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
Join me, Rishi Sunak, as I take your calls on LBC.
Put your questions to the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, only on LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Siân Berry, Robert Hayward, Ella Whelan and Jonathan Liss with us answering your calls. 0345 6060 973. I don't think I've given the text number out yet, have I? 84850. And that's what Doreen in Barnsley has texted into. She says, apparently no migrants will board the barge until next week. Will the lawyers, pen pushers and woke warriors... You didn't use the word lefty in lefty lawyers, pen pushers and woke warriors ever let our democratically elected government actually carry out its policy to stop the boats, Jonathan Liss?
Look, I think that we can get focused on these specific issues. Now, obviously, there are specific issues about this barge, and the most important one being about fire safety was the one that I was reading about the other day, and obviously about human rights, because contrary to some commentary in this country, migrants, however they've arrived in this country, are human beings and they do have rights, and they deserve to be held in appropriate conditions while their claims are being processed. But that really takes us to the core of the issue, which is how this country deals with asylum. And that's obviously we have this new horrific piece of legislation, the Illegal Migration Act, which is interestingly named because it does fly in the face of international law according to the UN. But there are very, very simple things the government could do to help itself.
We do talk about this a lot. I don't really want to go into the whole argument about asylum policy.
We wouldn't need this barge here if the government was actually on top of the asylum system. So we have this conversation about where we house migrants and asylum seekers. But the only reason we're having that conversation is because the government has so spectacularly botched this entire system. Now, that is something that people can get, that's an argument that people can agree with on whatever side of the position they're on. But I have to keep making the point that if you had a humane system which, for example, allowed asylum seekers to make a claim in France, that would completely obviate the need for these barges, because you would have people having their claims processed in France. If they were successful, they would then be allowed safe and legal routes to enter this country and then enter the workforce and enter Britain's housing, and they wouldn't have these problems of barges. But the government can't do that because it doesn't want to be seen as soft on migration and annoy the editors of the Mail and the Telegraph. And so we have these ridiculous situations where the government is having to shell out millions and millions of pounds completely unnecessarily, not good for migrants, not good for the taxpayer, just so it doesn't offend its own right-wing base.
Robert Hayward.
The suggestion that the French will willingly sit there and host the migrants, asylum seekers, while the British government deals with these applications just does not stand up. One of the things that depresses me about this debate is that there has been, and I've listened to large parts of the debate, much of which is very moving and very intellectually sound in the House of Lords, but there is a lack of a serious alternative at all points. And as for Jonathan's opening comment in relation to the boat that we're talking about, if he goes on to Wikipedia and checks the boat that is actually being talked about, and I'm quoting here, the Germans used it for asylum seekers for 4 years. So this is not some horrendous accommodation which is unacceptable to the world. It was used by the Germans, according to Wikipedia, for asylum seekers, quote unquote. So please, can we either have some serious alternatives for dealing with asylum seekers? I have concerns about some of the elements of the legislation, but I want to listen to some serious alternatives. And can we please stop the name calling about cruel and horrendous and all the rest of it, when other countries have used exactly the same boats.
No other country has opted out of the international asylum regime by introducing legislation like the Illegal Migration Act.
In relation to the asylum seekers, the Germans managed to deport 3/4 of all the applicants we deport a quarter, and yet they're operating the same
75%
legislation.
of asylums have their claims deemed to be successful. And if you want to have Germany as an example, then that's great, because how many millions of people have they let in to no discernible harm to German society? I wish we followed the Germans' example, because they've actually shown some humanity, unlike us.
Well, if you look at the pictures from inside this barge about how it's been refurbished and the accommodation that's there, I think people would be pushed to say that it was not proper accommodation. I mean, it looks almost like hotel accommodation. But Siân Berry, the texter here, clearly thinks that it's lefty lawyers, she says pen pushers and woke warriors, trying to override the democratically elected government. Now, this week we've heard that there are fire concerns. I don't know who's brought those up.
The fire brigade locally, I understand.
Okay.
Yeah, they need to sign it off. But you're right, Jonathan. You know, we have to get a system that actually works. And the point is, most people who reach these shores and claim asylum are doing so completely legitimately and are eventually given the right to stay. And by putting all these barriers in people's ways, by not giving people legal routes, we're creating enormous dangers. The people crossing the channel are taking enormous risks. They're fueling organised crime. This is not a way to run a system where we fulfil our international obligations to take people who are facing oppression, who are facing war, discrimination. All of these things are reasons why people can legitimately claim asylum in this country. And doing all these things to put people off is not on. And yes, we are housing people in hotels in conditions that are also unacceptable, but at least that's within the community. The point of this barge is to separate out those people, to treat them more like they're being kept in detention. They're not going to be able to circulate within the local community. People from the local community are not going to be able to reach them to see if they're all right, which is what local authorities have been doing with people in hotels. It's a complete mess, and the government just is using the whole system as a political football, and real people who have real claims to receive asylum from this country are suffering as a result. And I'm afraid, you know, people being whipped up to think this is simply a woke crusade are missing the point. We can all see from the climate disasters that are happening all around the world how little it would take for us to be in the same position as a lot of these people trying to reach our shores, who often have relatives here in the first place. This is why a lot of people's claims survive.
Alternative?
Well, I mean, the alternative we have at the moment, which is we have a desperate shortage of accommodation, and we are housing a lot of people in hotels, which is not ideal, but it is better than this.
But whenever people come up with alternatives, whether it's the barge or whether it's now they've apparently ordered 2,000 tents, everyone finds a reason to say, well, this is inhumane, but somehow people do have to be accommodated, and yet nobody from the opposition party seems to be able to come up with an alternative of how that will happen.
Well, quicker processing would lead to less people needing to be, you know, kept in these kinds of conditions. They'd be able to claim normal benefits and be able to work. And most people are just banned from working, which is why they need support.
It is, I mean, I agree with Siân and Jonathan. It is a pretty uncontroversial point, and everybody knows it, that from, you know, the Windrush scandal to what's going on now, simple things of, you know, government departments not being able to process filing, not being able to answer emails, not being able to just do the proper job of running an office has meant that the asylum system is ground to a halt. And the problem with housing people on a barge or in a hotel is not how soft the beds are, but it's the fact that you are detained. You don't actually get to mix in with the community in a kind of like, or go to the shops and, you know, chat at the local pub and the things that actually make a community, because you're not yet a citizen, so you can't act in the same way, work in the same way, socialise in the same way, and that leads to some of the tensions, in part leads to some of the tensions. But I mean, to come down hard on you guys, yes, lots of the people who are coming are genuine asylum seekers. Lots of them are not. And my solution to that, because I want more liberal approach to immigration across the board, would be to change our immigration policy, which I think is extremely punitive. It means that none of the working class of Europe can come, or anywhere else for that matter can come, because you have to have a PhD and all the rest of it, which seems a bit ridiculous when all the government goes on about is HGV drivers and things that don't require a PhD in quantum physics or whatever. So we've got that bit screwed up. But if you're an average person who lives in these areas that are having suddenly, out of the blue, large numbers of people from wherever in the world planted on them, in a place where resources are stretched, and where there are already sort of social tensions, and people feel like, as we've been talking about throughout the whole programme, politics is just done to them. They're not consulted. They don't have any say in any of this. They see what's going on with an inability to tackle small boats, as the issue has become, but I think it's much broader than that, as being the country out of control. I think actually the funny thing about Brexit and its aftermath with the discussion about immigration is that both the Labour Party and the Conservatives took Brexit to be, people care about immigration, therefore let's have quite a small-minded discussion about either, about how we lessen it, how we crack down and how we create hostile environments. It's actually much more complicated than that. I think most people, anyway, a lot of people I talk to who are working class Brexit voters, for example, are very liberal in terms of immigration. They work with immigrants. They, whether it's the NHS or anywhere else, they're absolutely fine with that. What they don't like is the idea that they don't have control over their borders, that there's no democratic say, there's no democratic process. And the fact that it's essentially impossible to deport someone at the moment because you have, I'm not going to go and say woke pen pushers, but I mean, you have these activists, it seems like, to the average person, that you have these activist lawyers who are just stopping a government
and crooked lawyers, as we've seen in the
last few headlines.
The vast majority are not crooked.
But, I don't want to malign.
No, but there are plenty out there, immigration lawyers, who bend the system and do act illegally, as we've seen. And
the problem is that is undemocratic. It's also undemocratic to use that. We all like human rights. No one's going to stand here and say, I would like to be attacked on all fronts because I think human rights are a terrible thing. But that is used to trump democracy. It's used to trump, national democracy, a sense that a government elected by its citizens can enact law, whether that's liberal or crack down on immigration. That can't happen at the moment. Okay. That's a problem.
Final word on this from Mo in Aberdeen, who says the core problem with our immigration system is the Home Office not being fit for purpose. In 2006, John Reid said this when he was Home Secretary, and his successors have never got a grip on sorting it out. 17 years ago, that was. I mean, if that isn't an indictment on both political parties, I don't know.
And that was before they split it off into the Ministry of Justice as well.
That was prisons, wasn't it? That went and
but that
justice,
used to be under the ambit of
but immigration has always been in the Home Office. Right, it's 20. No, it's not 20. It's 8. See on the clock here it says 20, so I read out 20 being a parrot. It's 8:48.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
We are in the company of Lord Robert Hayward, and I know it's incorrect when you put it like that. I get people, but people want to know what your first name is. If I say Lord Hayward, it just sounds so formal, doesn't it? What did you say?
So it's not Debrett's. No one cares.
No, exactly. Jonathan, that's the voice of Jonathan Liss, in case you hadn't worked it out. Ella Whelan is here, and Siân Berry as well. Right, let's go to our next caller. It's Shuvik in Orpington. Hello, Shuvik.
Oh, hello, Ian, and hello to the panel. I'd like to know the panel's response to the government's announcement of more oil and gas licences in the North Sea.
Right, we talked about this a lot on the programme yesterday. Ella Whelan.
I think that it's a sensible move because there has always been a fallacy at the heart of net zero planning that we can all of a sudden give up on the main area in which we make cheap energy, or relatively cheap energy, for the mass of people who need to heat their homes, keep their fridge running, blah, blah, blah. That we can just switch that off in a matter of 10, 20, 30 years and move on to, renewables or whatever it is that actually a lot of them aren't ready. If you look at the IEA's analysis itself, the kind of technology that it talks about that says that that will have half emissions cut by 2050, a huge proportion of that is by their own admission, in the prototype stage, in the sort of research and development stage. These are things that are not yet not just manifest and working and proven, but are not sort of commercially viable, not ready on a mass level. I mean, Ian, I don't want to set you off on electric cars again, but
please don't. That way lies madness.
But just even something like that as an example, even where the technology does exist, it hasn't become able to, on a mass scale, meet our needs. And I think the thing that sort of shocks me at the moment is that there has been a kind of a widespread acceptance of green austerity, of the idea that people should have to lower their living standards. I mean, there was a big discussion on PM on Radio 4 this afternoon about boilers, heat pump boilers, and
that's why you should always be listening to Tom Swarbrick at that time.
Well, it was just this incredible discussion of people saying, well, yes, they don't get your house as warm, and yes, you do have to put thousands of pounds into insulation that probably lots of you don't have, and yes, but come on, it's a good thing. There is just this sort of cognitive dissonance about what the lives of the vast majority of people in this country are like, how their pockets are feeling at the moment in the cost of living crisis, and then you have these sort of green bunnies coming along and saying, sorry, Siân, I don't mean you, but this sort of
no, you do mean Siân,
because there's this sort of happy clappy.
She's a fully fledged rabbit, not a bunny.
We have to love the planet. Sort of childish discussion, which doesn't take into account the consequences of your actions or the consequence of the plans to essentially cut off the country from cheap and affordable energy. Okay. And I think that's pretty bad.
I'll leave Siân a moment to gather herself after that cruel insult. Jonathan.
Look, the fundamental point here is that giving new licences in the North Sea is not going to help any of our problems, either in the short term or the long term. It's going to make everything worse. It's not going to reduce energy bills. First of all, because it will take decades for any of these explorations to bear fruit. Most importantly, the energy that will be gathered potentially from these sites isn't even going to increase our energy supply or capacity, because these are private companies which tend to export the oil and the gas that they actually get from the North Sea. So these are private companies.
That's not a crime.
It's not a crime, but it's not the answer to any of the problems that the government is purporting to solve. This is really just fueling and helping fossil fuel companies, literally fueling them, to cream off extra profits at a time when they're already making more money than they know what to do with for their shareholders. And it's not helping us in any way. We haven't even established, as Norway did, a sovereign wealth fund that could have, over the last 50 years, gone into the exchequer to actually help Britain develop its infrastructure and and can now be helping with our green agenda. So to think that the UK was in charge of COP, was leading the sort of the world, if you like, on climate, at least the climate sort of conference, less than a year ago, and is now throwing it all overboard, squandering all the goodwill that we managed to accumulate in that time. Because, again, of a by-election result, 500 people made a protest, and now we're completely
weren't issued as a result of a by-election.
The mood music, Ian, is that no one needs to worry about the environment anymore because apparently the public doesn't want it anymore, but the public does want it. The public does want green energy and does believe in climate change.
Siân.
I mean, Ella talked about we're not thinking about the consequences of our actions. I mean, this has been the history of climate policy all the way through. The last time the Conservatives did a U-turn on green policy was the David Cameron days of ditching the green crap back in 2013. We now know the results of the reversals in policy that were put in place then. And just for people's bills at home, the insulation that was not installed, the improvements to the energy efficiency in people's homes that occurred there is costing people £8 billion every single year as a consequence of that last reversal. This will cost people absolutely hugely if that is where the government's focus goes, instead of into massive green investment. And yeah, this is optimistic stuff because investing in insulation in people's homes creates jobs all over the country. Building new renewable energy infrastructure, sorting out our grid so that we can do that is enormous. Are you going to
pay for it for everyone, or are people going to have to pay for it? I mean, look, if
it's government investment in that kind of infrastructure that we need, we had a good scheme that was cancelled before.
I would love to continue this, but we haven't heard from Robert yet, and we've only got a minute left.
Just very quickly, Jonathan says nobody benefits. Every single one of the people sat round this panel will have a pension. BP's profits pay into those pensions. The profits that they announced this morning was 70% down on what they were last year. So don't come across with crass generalisations. Let's look at it in a considered basis in terms of windfall taxes and the like, and look at the implications overall. There are arguments on environmental matters, very strong ones, but don't destroy it by generalising.
Right, let's finish off with a fun question from Jane in Inverness. NASA has lost its Voyager 2 probe billions of miles away from the Earth. What's the most annoying thing you've lost over the years? Jonathan.
Probably my virginity, but sadly that's never coming back, so I'll just have to make the most of it.
So many comments spring to mind, but Siân.
I mean, annoying in terms of annoyingness, when you come back and your bike is not where you thought it was going to be. That has happened to me far too many times, and yeah, then you really are stuck.
Proving your green credentials all over again. Ella.
Well, I'm going to keep on theme with the car. Dad lost the car in Chessington when we were kids, and it was like that episode of Seinfeld where...
Lost the car?
Yeah, in the car park, because there's like millions of them there, and he had to be driven around on the golf buggy, and it was all extremely painful for a young teenager like me to watch that happening, so... That's the one time I've ever hated driving.
Was that in the days before remote controls? So, because of course nowadays you can just go around the car park pressing your car key, can't you? And somewhere will open up. Rob,
a letter to prove that a local council was wrong, and I could not find it. I searched high and low, and the net result was that the local council continued doing something which they admitted they were wrong doing.
I'm just going to ask you, because we're not quite out. In the next hour, we're doing something about relationships where the age gap is massive. Have any of you ever been in a relationship where the age gap was more than, say, 15 years, even if it was only for a night?
My mother's listening to this.
So that's a yes.
But there's a serious point there that Gen Zs are very, very puritanical about this, and I can't quite understand why. Because as far as I'm concerned, the law exists for a reason. If you're over the age of 16, the law determines that you're able to make sexual choices and be autonomous. And I think that Philip Schofield was thrown to the wolves partly because
of this
age
is taking
gap.
a turn.
No, seriously, but
I was just going to make a joke about Gen Z being prudes, but
they are prudes.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed to. Siân, Robert, Ella and Jonathan, thank you very much. As I say, coming up in the next hour, Candace Bushnell has given fans a glimpse into her dating life, which she described as crazy. The Sex and the City author, who drew inspiration from her own life to write about the characters in Sex and the City, said there was a time when she dated two men who were 70 years apart in the same week. One was 21, one was 91. So many questions come to mind, but I want to know, what are the challenges of dating someone or being in a permanent relationship with somebody who is much older or much younger than you? I'm rather looking forward to this hour. 0345 6060 973. And why do we judge men and women differently depending on their ages in these kind of relationships?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Margaret Ferrier says she will not stand in an upcoming by-election in Scotland after losing her parliamentary seat.